So welcome back, everyone. This is the committee room. Obviously, we're not going to go back to the agenda and discuss long-range planning. This is the next installment of our meetings with respect to this topic. So as is typical and as customary, I'll ask our village manager, David Fieldman, to please introduce the topics for tonight's discussion. Mr. Fieldman.
This is actually our third meeting in a series of 4. If for those interested, you have an outline here that I think is pretty self-explanatory. Tonight we're talking about stormwater and setting stormwater fees, how we generate revenue, and our plan for investing those fees in our infrastructure system. It's great to see everybody out tonight participating in the community about such an important topic. Our issue on stormwater is very simple. It's a financial gap. The revenue we currently receive from the fees, the stormwater utility fees, is not enough to achieve the recommended level of service. What is the recommended level of service in stormwater? We're talking about how well does our stormwater system, the system that collects, stores, and conveys rainwater, how well does it function? How many rain events in a given year does it work for? Our recommended level of service can be described as a system that would safely store and convey 95% of the storm events that we expect to see. I think this is much easier to understand than that 100-year event, 50-year event system, which frankly doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you're a statistician or an engineer. But this concept, I think, makes sense to most people, and that is, will our system safely convey and store 95% of the rain events? What do we mean by safely store and convey? Really what we're talking about is keeping water out of structures. Keeping water out of structures. So in heavy events, safely storing and conveying, you will still see streets that have water in them. They're used to convey. In portions, they may be close to unpassable, but in this event, safely storing means a passable street that may have water in it. It also means that areas of your yards, residential yards that are lower, swales, if you will, they would also be filled in the extremely heavy rain events. So that's a picture of what we mean by safely store and convey, keeping it out of structures, houses, basements, that kind of thing. Why 95%? Why not 100%? There's no such thing as being able to build a system that will handle every single type of storm. No matter what we design and build, there's a natural occurrence that will exceed it at some point. So 95% is pretty much an industry standard and something that we are proposing that we should strive to. So safely store and convey 95% of all the rain events. Well, if that's our desired state, our recommended level of service, where are we right now? Well, it's no surprise in a village of our age that the service level varies throughout the village. It varies from really no formalized system at all, no ditches, no culverts, no storm pipes, to brand new systems that were just built in new subdivisions that would meet or exceed that recommended level of service. We did not go through and map or analyze the whole village on a parcel by parcel basis, so we can't tell you the exact percentage of where we fall in this continuum. But it's pretty simple. If you're in a subdivision that was built post-World War II, you have some formalized stormwater system. It probably does not meet this recommended level of service. If you were a subdivision in the past 1972, built 72 or after, certainly those in the 80s, you probably have a modern system with detention basins, etc., getting very close to, if not meeting, this recommended level of service. And if you're in something built, a subdivision built after 1992, when DuPage County stormwater ordinance went into place, you're definitely meeting that recommended level of service. So with that in mind, most of our village south of 63rd Street has a modern system and performs pretty well. Also the extreme north end of our village, up Orchard Brook, etc., performs pretty well, although there are some areas with challenges. And then all the older areas in between fall in a variety of the spectrum, depending on how much we've retrofitted, put back in after the subdivision was built. So our current level of service varies throughout the village. Well, if we want to go from our current level of service to our recommended level of service, we really need to perform two types of things to our system. First is we need to build new systems where the systems don't exist at all. and we need to upgrade the stormwater systems where they are not meeting that standard, where they're too small, they're obsolete. Those are capital projects, putting in new pipes, replacing pipes that are too small, building detention basins where none exist. So those are capital projects. And then, of course, the systems that we do have that are functioning, that are meeting or exceeding this standard now, we need to make sure we maintain them. These systems, if not maintained, can frankly just get clogged with debris. If they get clogged with debris, they start to not function to their highest capacity. And so in that case, you could have systems that are designed to meet the standard but aren't functioning to capacity because we lack proper maintenance. So two things: build and enlarge the system where none exists or it's too small, and maintain the system that does meet our recommended level of service. Well, if we don't have all the money we desire or need to meet the recommended level of service, and we have to choose among those two categories, which one should we prioritize and why? Well, what we found is there's no compelling reason to prioritize one over the other. This is very different than our street system, where there were many financial reasons to prioritize maintenance before you go back and rebuild streets. In this situation, you can pick either. It's a trade-off. If we choose to put more money in capital projects, then the areas that are underserved due to lack of a system or a small system get closer to that desired recommended level of service. And if we put more money into maintenance, then systems that already meet the standard have a higher likelihood of not getting clogged. So a higher likelihood that they will function as they're designed. So it's very simple. More money into building new projects means areas that don't have the systems get better. More money into maintenance means the areas that already have the system continue to be likely to function properly. No compelling reason to put one over the other. The cost of maintenance in real terms, not accounting for inflation, is the same today as it is tomorrow. It only increases by the cost of inflation. Same thing on capital projects. Replacing a small pipe with a big pipe costs the same today as it will in 20 years, but for inflation. Not the case in other systems we've been talking about, like roads. So this leaves to the policymakers just the trade-off. With limited resources, where do we put our money and why? That's what we're talking about tonight. Tonight's objective is to have a dialogue among the community and the council members to update our plan for how much money we take in fees and where we invest that money in the system, capital or maintenance. I'll draw your attention to page 3.5 of the document. We had a couple of hard copies.
Sorry, Dave, before you move to that, with respect to the no compelling reason to prioritize over one or the other as it pertains to capital projects and maintenance projects, there is prioritization within each of those columns. So for example, once you've decided to put dollars towards capital, we have a prioritized list of projects that if we had X dollars, which ones we would do based on objective criteria such as, basically it's the very scientific most bang for the buck.
It's the bang for the buck approach.
Likewise, there's a system for prioritizing in an objective fashion what maintenance projects you're going to do, because if they've ceased to work altogether, that's probably a high priority. If it's one that's just dropped a few percentage points in its functionality, that may be a lower priority.
That's absolutely correct. And if you're very interested in which projects are prioritized or how we prioritize maintenance, there's actually a much more detailed report on our website. And we'll talk more about which projects we pick to do and when as part of our budget process later this fall. The purpose of this meeting tonight is to talk about the planning level so we can have a plan for which we base future decisions of investment on. And that's what we're talking about here tonight. I will call your attention to page 3.5 where we've put a chart in of depicting how much money we would need to spend to get to the recommended level of service immediately, and then broke it down into maintenance and capital. And then what we project we would actually spend if we continue with our current plan. The bottom line here is that the plan that staff is putting forth for continued discussion by the council and the community is the plan that would raise annual stormwater utility fees by 8.5% to 9% a year, every year for multiple years, at least 14 or 15 years. So 8.5% to 9%. The model shows 8.7%. So a significant increase each year. As far as where we would invest that revenue, this plan shows a heavy emphasis on capital projects. So from 2015 to 2023, we would be emphasizing capital projects, building capital, storm sewers, et cetera, where they don't currently exist, upsizing the ones that are too small, those kind of expenses. Very strong emphasis on that. To do that, that would require bond issuances of $10 million each in 2017 and 2020. And then the capital expenses for the balance of this plan are primarily paying off those bonds where we've invested in capital projects. On the maintenance side, this plan calls for spending about half of the amount recommended on maintenance and then moving to 100% by 2028. So a straight line increase between 50% of the recommended level up to 100% of the recommended level. So again, what this will allow us to do is to build capital projects, the ones we've already identified prior to the major flood event we had in April of 2013, and to build the projects that we became aware of as a result of that flood in 2013. We would be building those under this plan starting really in 2017 through 2023. There's much more detail in the report, but at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to the mayor and council. If you have any questions, comments, or you can jump right into dialogue.
Sure. Well, obviously, thank you for the presentation, encapsulating a lot of detail into just a couple of whiteboards. That in and of itself is a feat. We have one round of experience with this, and I think the thing to emphasize here is we're not getting down to the detail yet. I think it's the third whiteboard indicates tonight we're really trying to stay at the 40,000 foot level and talk about the multi-year plan, revenue generation, and the question of allocation of those dollars to either capital projects or maintenance projects. And we'll get into the lower level detail as we get into the budget discussions in September and December. So we're going to try to keep it there tonight so that we can proceed in an orderly fashion. I mean, the reality is we've got both maintenance needs and capital needs, and in order to get from A to B, there's certain revenues that have to be generated. And then the question is, again, how much to allocate between capital and maintenance. That's certainly a valid topic for discussion. And I just think that we have and I know we'll get into that also later in the budget process, as was mentioned earlier, in terms of the prioritization, no different than, for example, the sidewalk matrix and other objective criteria that we utilize to determine, okay, well, where are you going to start? What project are you going to do first? What maintenance are you going to do first? And why? Not just because something's on the south side versus the north side, but there's an objective criteria as to why you would do that project. And usually the criteria are you're going to get the most value for the dollars, so you start there because it delivers the best return on investment. With that sort of, and that wasn't a question or a comment, that was more of an introductory statement. Let's start with whether there are any questions from the council about anything that's been presented. If there's questions, we'll address those and then come back to the council for comments, and then we'll go to the audience, we'll come back, and we'll discuss this as much as everyone would like to. Jeff?
Thank you, Mayor. Dave, when do we think we would get into the capital projects that would require more land acquisition and less use in our current existing space or property that we own? How far down the schedule is that?
As you can imagine, in a built-out community, trying to put in detention basins usually requires land acquisition. So most of the capital projects have some element of buying land, either for pipes or storage basins. Land acquisition generally takes some time. We try to minimize the amount of acquisition without participation from the property owner. So we plug a couple of years in for land acquisition on each of those projects. Those projects, the planning stages and acquisition stages would begin immediately, but would likely take a couple years before we actually get into building the projects. We need to know how much land we have before we can start design. So that puts it out a couple years. So specifically, probably around that 2017 timeframe, which was some of the reasons why we said those projects that came about after the April 2013 flood event would start in 2017 and go for the next 6, 7 years.
Well, that's helpful, because I think, the recommendation starts with that in mind as that kind of being the bigger expense and the longer time constraint on the plan. I'm going to back up a little bit, but we just talked in the other room, and gladly everybody was in there to hear that our bond rating is extremely high. We have AAA bond rating, so we can go out for 2 bonds for stuff like this. But I think a big part of that is because of that 40,000 foot level discussion that we're having tonight, that we set out a plan. We set out a path, so we're ready for it. But it's a path, but it's also flexible, I think, because while we have a plan for capital projects and maintenance projects that's been delivered by staff, we also have the ability, because we have revenue on hand, to be flexible and reactionary to any of the issues that come up. I think if we look at what's happening right now in Downers Grove, there was some stuff that happened in that April storm that we're repairing right now. If we look at what's happening right now or what's happened in the last number of years, there's a lot of detention and storage facilities that are new and are at the 95% of recommended level of service. And that's all because of what really started in 2007 and 6. Those big storms back then through the 2008. Dave doesn't like when I go back to the stormwater master plans, but those guys over there do, because that was the foundation. Those guys are the engineers. That was the foundation of where we are today. And all these steps that we're working up to and are at now allow us to have that 40,000 foot look, and it's worked. It's worked for our sidewalk matrix. It's worked for our roadway plan. I mean, that was the last big one that we did. That's given us kind of a set path for that, and we know exactly where we're going. We know how many segments of road we're doing. We know where those roadways are going to be replaced. Now, if you take that discussion, tie it into the needs that we have here in stormwater, you can get that best bang for your buck, the bundling projects, not only roads, but stormwater, water mains, sidewalks, any infrastructure that we need to do at street corners for traffic calming. We just did a bunch of that over in the Whittier School area. So these are all steps in the plan to get us to a point where we can talk about the finances. I think that from my perspective, I'm a maintenance guy. That's my job during the day, so I like to maintain things and make sure they run right. So the fact that there is maintenance in there of the areas that need it the most is important to me. But it's also important to start that engineering and the planning for the capital projects, because those, as Dave said, do take time. But we can look at various areas around town that show a direct impact and a direct result of our stormwater process and plan. The mayor said that this isn't new anymore. I still think it's a little bit new, but we do have that a couple of years under our belt now. And this is an innovative and extremely high-level way to generate revenue for a stormwater project, stormwater plan. And I probably say it too often, but this is kind of one of those things that we win awards for because we do it so well. Life isn't about winning awards. Life is about doing things well that get recognized not only by our community but by other communities, and that we are kind of leading this example for other communities, not only here in Illinois but nationwide. And anytime I see that, it tells me that we're doing something right. We do prioritize, we do do our due diligence, as we talked about earlier, to make sure that we're putting our money in the right spot. I think that the plan that's laid out by staff is appropriate. I think it gives us a well-bundled machine of maintenance and operations, but there's still a little bit of a wedge of flexibility in there for any things that do come up in the short term or even in the long term as the infrastructure changes. Things change. We've had those master plans since 2008, and projects that were high priorities are now low or even medium or even not a priority anymore because of a different piece of capital improvement that has taken care of a lot of the localized flooding areas around town. So from my perspective, I think the 40,000 foot level gets me back down to the staff recommendation. We have been doing this the right way. We have a revenue source. We're very fortunate to have a dedicated revenue source for stormwater. Many of our surrounding communities are still struggling with just balancing their budget and their general funds, and we're talking about going out into the future, which I think is a great step for us to take. It allows us to have a plan in place and allows us to keep our finances in check and gives us a path. So that seems like I talked a lot in a row there. Sorry about that, but this is important stuff for us to plan for the future, to get to our budget, and then to really literally show the bonding agencies so they can see what we want to do and how it's going to affect our rating. So we continue to see those savings down the road in not only our interest rates, but refinancing opportunities.
Thank you. Just a quick question. It's unrelated to what you just said, but it just occurred to me while you were talking. Land acquisition for capital projects, that's one thing, obviously. But then there's also the strategic buyouts, where we're not doing a project, we're just eliminating the problem by removing the structure. So if the goal was not to get water into houses, there are some situations where there's no engineering on the planet that's going to effectively solve the issue. So what communities will do, or what municipalities will do, is actually purchase the structure and thereby eliminating the problem, because there's no structure to flood anymore. And it's just, you can then do something else with it, make a park or something, but, and then there are other instances where we have to buy property in order to obtain access, or the easement in order to be able to maintain something that we can't maintain right now because we don't have the rights to do that. And those aren't projects per se, they're strategic buyouts. But I assume that's all included, just for everyone's benefit, within the capital
It
bucket.
is. If the concern, as the mayor said, is there's water getting into structures, there's two ways to solve that. You can engineer it so that the water doesn't go near the structures. Most of the time, that's cost effective. Or you can simply remove the structure from where the water wants to be. There, you just buy the house and tear it down. An example of that, where that was more cost effective, is the recent purchase of 4 or 5 homes on Lee Avenue, just sort of south of Bach.
And Second and Cumner.
Second
Right.
and Cumberland, which actually was both.
Right, and when we get to it, and I'm going to define my own comments here and not jump ahead to September and December, but just by way of heads up to the rest of the council, currently DuPage County is working on an amendment to the action plan for second allocation of CDBG disaster recovery funds. What the heck does all that mean? Some additional dollars from HUD and elsewhere, including FEMA, that would provide funds for these strategic buyouts that the manager just described, whereby, and this isn't finalized yet, but it's being discussed by the Stormwater Committee as well as the Economic Development Committee, where there would be a pool of funds, where right now there's a program that includes $7 million. This would be an additional $18.9 million that would be available for DuPage County municipalities to participate in these strategic buyouts at a 25% match. And so it's not an unlimited cure-all, but for some of these strategic buyouts that are, in some instances, the only solution, there may be some outside dollars by the time we get to talking about it in September, once this goes through. It hasn't been finalized yet, it was just in a committee this morning, but something to keep in mind.
Mayor, could I ask a question? The 40,000 foot level, I see we don't, we're not specifically endeavoring to discuss the specific amount of the fee increase in 2015, but we do have revenue generation on top. And what exactly, I mean, and maybe staff, what direction would you like from the council on this topic?
I think as an example, a 40,000 foot kind of comment would be, understand the plan, and I'd like to actually raise revenue more quickly so we can do both capital and maintenance to the fullest extent as fast as possible. Or, I think the revenue generation and the impact on the community is too much. I'd rather look for ways to keep the fees down and then therefore not do as many projects or maintenance as described. That'd be a 40,000 foot comment. We would modify the plans based on the council commentary tonight. Then the plan would be presented, and an actual specific rate for 2015 would be generated in September to launch the budget discussions. It could be changed and voted on specifically as part of the budget in 15. Does that make sense, what we're looking for?
Yeah.
Plan
Yes.
level versus percents? Yeah.
And likewise, right now, you've got basically a 15-year spread up there. If Commissioner Olson said, well, you know what, I like the plan, but I want to spread that out over 20 years. That would be a 40,000 foot level comment.
That's a great comment. The other thing to note about these things is these, you can rely on this analysis. It's very good at the planning level. It's not a financial model. It's not like a slider scale. It's not dollar for dollar. And the further you get out on this, the more conceptual it gets. So a 3 to 5 year look ahead in detail is very good, and that's what we have here. Beyond 5 years, I think Commissioner Barnett has said this many times, we really don't know what's going to happen specifically beyond 5 years, but this is sort of a roadmap we can rely on.
Nice segue. No compelling reason to prioritize. I guess I take a little issue with that. That's a financial and technical kind of a commentary.
Correct.
And, you know, I think we've got compelling reason by nature of our position to do a better job than we're doing on maintenance. The assets that the village owns, you know, are kind of to some degree entrusted to us. And I don't feel comfortable with the idea of saying we're implementing a new tax and probably 15 years or so down the road, we might be maintaining the stuff we own where we think we should. Because as you said, that lack of, you know, crystal ball, if you will, that extends out beyond much more than about 3 to 5 years, it's foggy. And so I would like us to, my 40,000 comment on this is, I'd like us to model what this looks like if we try and get that maintenance to the level we believe it should be in a much shorter horizon, like, you know, 5 years from the time we started, so like a 18, 19 kind of a range. One of the other elements, beside that we don't know what it's going to look like down the road, is our, you know, revenue. I don't like to be Debbie Downer at all these meetings, but we spent some pretty rough times not that long ago. And whether they occur again or not, certainly everybody is hoping they won't. Everybody's doing their best to ensure that we're prepared should they. But as it relates to deciding when you're going to start doing your maintenance, I'd much rather say in 2020, I'm going to defer a capital project because I've got a change of events relative to our financial strength, then I'm going to take that maintenance I thought I was going to get to doing and push it out a little farther yet, because those assets need to be maintained. And so, you know, we're going to eventually, I suppose, land on some sort of an increase next year, but I'd like to see us move, or at least model what it looks like, to move that maintenance goal of truly maintaining things the way we believe we technically should, to within about 5 years of the plan implementation, which is 2013/14, so that's an 18-19 kind of thing. If the result of that, I can't speak to what that looks like until it's modeled, but if, as you just mentioned, or you know, if the result of that was, well, therefore the fee that we believe we can live with or that the community can handle causes the extension of the capital portion to expand, that is the slider scale portion of what's going on. But I just don't feel comfortable sitting here saying I'm implementing a tax fee, whatever we want to call it, specifically so that we can get our stormwater house in order, and saying I'm still going to take 15 plus years to get to maintaining the stuff we have. That doesn't feel right to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like us to at least model what it looks, before we decide something, at least model what it looks like to move that way forward.
If we took all the revenue that we currently get and did only maintenance and no capital starting next year, we have enough money to do all the maintenance, and we have the capacity as an organization to do all maintenance. So I want to make sure that that point got made. And I also want to understand, is your comments telling us to reallocate, take dollars earmarked in this plan from capital to maintenance? Or is it a suggestion of look at increasing revenue faster to do both, or any combination
The
thereof?
answer is yes. The answer, I mean, I know it's a non-answer, but we don't really know what that looks like. And it's hard, I think, you know, one of the things that I think was a little bit of a failure of this group the last time we were talking about it was this, you know, we got 7 of us, and if it's 8.7%, should it be 6.35 or 9.12? I think that was kind of BS. Our job is to try and really set policy level about what is it that we want to accomplish. There may be a point, if you try to do what I want to do, and instead of a 15% increase, that we just can't live with that, fine, fair enough. But let's start with the policy decision about what we're trying to accomplish, as opposed to what do I feel good about saying for percent increase.
Got it, thanks, Buck.
Yes. Becky?
So, you know, around town we hear from 2 types of people that say, please don't increase our fee at all, we don't want to pay any more money. Or then we hear from people that say, I'm totally flooding, you have to help me, please do something. So it's very hard to balance those 2 opinions, you know, and that's kind of what we're trying to do here. Dave, I think you kind of explained it, in response to Commissioner Barnett, but if we didn't raise anything forever, we just kept stormwater fees at the existing rate, would we, so you're saying we would be able to do the required level of maintenance, but would we be able to do any capital projects?
If we took the current fees, held them steady, used all the revenue for maintenance for a couple of years, we would be able to do all the maintenance required. But then as the inflationary costs of maintenance activity went up and our fees stayed the same, we would start to fall behind. That's what would happen on the maintenance side. On the capital side, you'll see a big, long, tall blue line in 2014. We do have the ability to invest in more capital projects now. We have money in the fund that we delayed in spending until we got the stormwater utilities stabilized. We wanted to make sure we knew what was going on before we spent that money. So we do have a significant amount of money, several millions of dollars, that are already earmarked for capital projects that are in the CIP. We could do those a year or two, maybe 3 of some capital projects. But on a sustainable level, what would happen is we'd have only enough money to do up to 100% of the maintenance for a couple years, then we'd fall short of that, and then we would actually shift to no money at all for capital. Or you could just take all that flat revenue and go on the capital side, and then your maintenance would fall off, and then there's that trade-off. We would not be sustainable if we just kept the revenue flat.
Okay.
That was, the point of this whole thing was to, sound like a broken record, I suppose, but was to generate additional revenue.
That's
So
it.
we have a lot of angst over what that really looks like, because nobody likes to go back to the public and say, we're raising your cost of operating and living here. But that was the point of the program, was to raise a whole lot more revenue. So we had this conversation last year about what was the effect of, minimizing the increase. Well, it's just to extend the time. None of that's changed. This is, the conversation we're having right now is how much additional revenue do we want to ask our residents to put up with, and in what fashion do we want to spend that revenue?
And in a certain respect, you almost want to kind of pull the Band-Aid off. Let's, kind of like you're saying, increase it so that we can just be done with increases and just get there and move on. But in another respect, people don't want us to increase it at all. So it's hard to balance it all.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I want to pull the Band-Aid off, because you're, at the end of this thing, it's gazillions of dollars, or certainly
Sure.
millions and millions. But part of what we're doing, one of the things, we had this conversation last year, and we talked a lot about inflation. Well, should 2014 be related to 2013 based on some kind of an inflation number? Nothing we're doing here right now, at least until 2028, as it's laid out, is inflationary related. It's frankly, no offense to anybody who might be in the room, it's frankly covering up for not having done what we should have done for the better part of 4 to 5 decades. So, it's going to be, is a Band-Aid, I don't know if it's a $20 million Band-Aid or a $4 million Band-Aid, but it isn't going to be a 3.1% this year and 1.2 next year, because that's what CPI is. Because that's not what we're fixing. We're fixing 5 decades or more so of not doing what we should have been doing.
And and just to jump in on that, where the rubber meets the road here, we're talking about it from a 40,000-foot view, but we're talking also about how many homes around the village are going to flood, and how many businesses around the village are going to flood. And I think there's a bit of merit to Becky's pulling the Band-Aid off. But at the same time, even if we did do that, and I'm not saying we should, but if we did, there's only so much staff capacity to get things done in one shot anyway. That being said, it'd be nice to do all of these projects and be able to say, we can get everybody to this recommended level of service and never have to raise the fee. If we said that, we'd be lying. And because of that, I think Jeff's got it right, that the staff recommendation makes a whole lot of sense. Now, if we want to change the slider and move the slider more in favor of maintenance for a while, I'd like to see what that looks like. Maybe not 5 years, maybe 10. Because we do have a responsibility to take care of the infrastructure that we have. But I don't think that to say that, well, we're just going to do inflationary increases or whatever else, and leave a large portion of the village that's either completely unserved or served by an infrastructure that is just plain too small, is a responsible thing to do for the 7 wells.
What years are we looking at doing bonding?
17 and 20,
And what's the dollar amount of those?
10 million or so each time.
For 10?
10
So 20?
Yes, sir.
And then, you know, we're also going to be, we have been, we just haven't had the same crowd at our other meetings that were talking about new village hall, fleet, police and fire departments. Have we spoken with our financial advisor on all these proposed, including village hall and redevelopment of those buildings, those bonds and this, and what the impact it could have in the long term, or the long-term effect on our rating?
Yes. The bonds that we're talking about that Sean just mentioned, potential bonds in stormwater, ongoing bonding every couple of years in the water system, and potentially bonds measured in tens of millions of dollars for new facilities, should we choose to invest in that fashion. We met with our financial advisor and took, not really the worst case scenario, but the largest amount of bond issuances in those multi-years, and found that because there are other bond issuances coming off that will be retired, that we are in a position to maintain the ratios and debt levels in the aggregate that earned us the AAA rating. So while we can't guarantee a specific rating, that's not up to us, we are positioned to continue with all the bonds we have in our long-range plans in each of those 3 systems.
Okay.
Did I hear your answer to Becky that we had 2-ish, maybe 3 years worth of likely capital project cash available, so to speak?
Yes, which is why this blue line here is so much bigger than even the recommended level. A lot of that is, almost 4 million of it is earmarked for a project right now that looks like would be changing. So that was a partnership with the Park District. So there are several $1 million that we could allocate to capital projects right now, and that's what our plan calls for.
So it's 17 and 20, as intended, at least at this point, bond issuances. If you said you were going to spend that money, capital money on capital work, and moved your maintenance way forward, what you could do is still spend $3 million-ish or something on capital work now, like we intended for the next 2-3 years, and then not start that again until a bond issuance, and just drag the bond issuance a couple of years out.
Yes. And
So
you
it wouldn't
could,
be
so
like you wouldn't be making improvements now, you would be doing $2-3 million worth of improvements.
yes, you can reduce the amount of fund balance spent on capital, shrink that blue line down, move some of that money into maintenance to move the maintenance line up, take the revenues coming in to focus them more on maintenance. So a shift to maintenance away from capital in the early years, and then look at adjusting the amounts of the bond issuances and the timing to get the capital side. Yes, you can do all
I
those
guess the
things.
reason I was trying to frame it that way is it doesn't, to move the maintenance way forward is not the same as not doing any capital. Those aren't necessarily linked.
Right.
Because of our fund balance, we
Yeah.
have some flexibility. We can do a little bit of both early on, but it's not sustainable.
Sure, but it's not sustainable under either scenario, that's why
Correct.
bond issues.
Correct.
Right.
But you just said something very important, that there's a project out there that's changing, potentially.
Yes.
And that's for whatever reason, but there's the flexibility that allows us, $1 million, $2 million swing up or down. And so if we have a plan put forward, we're going to be able to look at something, say there's another storm, there's another issue that comes up, failure, sewer pipes fail all over town all the time without even huge storm events. We have that flexibility in there. But I think that high-level discussion has to be, and it's starting to work itself out here, what's our 7 priority, maintenance or capital? I think if we can continue to have a little bit of both, or, kind of creeping up, we're kind of following along with the staff recommendation, but we have to always, in my opinion, have that flexibility built in there. So I guess I just repeated myself.
Yeah,
but
that's part of the reason why we do this every year, because we're going to have the benefit of the prior year's experience, whether it's dollars coming from FEMA, or it's some unexpected event, or whatever it is, some big rain event, better pricing. There's a gazillion things that could go into it, and we're going to see where we're at. But you're right, we need to have the overall plan to guide the actions that will arise from whatever that recent past experience is, whatever it might be, up, down, forwards, backwards. It's one other thing, and then I'm gonna, yeah, sure. When it comes to maintenance, one of the things I'm very interested in, we'll get to it, maybe not tonight, but if something is so clogged it's not functioning, it's the equivalent of having nothing there at all.
That is correct.
So you can kind of look at a capital project and that kind of maintenance project the same, because if it doesn't work at all, then you might as well have nothing there. But then it gets down to degrees of maintenance, and we'll have to have more detailed discussion of that.
And that-
I agree we ought to be maintaining the things that we should, and then it comes up to defining what should, and where we want to set that bar. But go ahead, Sean.
I have a quick question. The current structure of the stormwater utility fee is that the only revenues or dollars that are in there is what we collect through the fee itself, correct?
That's correct. This is a pure utility on the funding.
So we could not, in our budgeting process, determine that we're not going to allocate X amount of money to a project and then transfer that difference to this fund.
You can choose to do that, however, the system is not set up in that fashion right now. Right now, the only revenues that go into the system are from stormwater utility fees, and conversely, the only thing we spend that money on is stormwater. That's the pure utility aspect of it. If you wanted to open up a discussion about the structure of the funding mechanism, then those movement of dollars from one capital system to another, one infrastructure system to another, become available to you. Let's do less sidewalks and more stormwater.
Correct.
Let's do less operating costs.
Anything.
Yeah.
And that's something that I would like us to look at. You haven't put anything on my name, but that's something I would like to do.
I'd like to second that.
Because I don't have a stomach to propose 8.7% annual fee increases for 15 years. I just don't. I'll let the elephant out now and just tell you that.
Well, that then opens up the discussion, which is way beyond the scope of tonight, of what are the plans for all those other capital projects that are just being, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul is what you're doing.
Not necessarily.
Well,
Oh, the
It's
sidewalk,
a-
how many more miles of sidewalks do we have?
it's a closed environment.
Yeah, and to that point, taking revenues away, expenditures away from the water system and the road system, probably not a good idea because
No,
then they won't
no.
be sustainable. But operating expenses and to a certain degree sidewalks after we get to the point of completing the matrix, that does become, if the council says we're open to structural change, then there's a pretty logical time to talk about sidewalk funding when we actually complete the multi-decade matrix, which is coming up in a year or two.
Right, and again, no matter what it is, whether it's new revenue sources, reallocated existing revenue sources, unforeseen events, new costs, federal dollars, whatever it is, the reason why we do this every year is because we can then take that into account. On that year when the sidewalk matrix ends and we have dollars that have traditionally been spent on sidewalks, that suddenly we can either end it and maybe not levy that money, that would be one choice too, or if we're going to continue to levy it, we now want to redirect it and subsidize a utility. There's all kinds of things you can do. That's changing the structure. But then again, that goes back to the decision, what are you going to do with those funds? Are you going to continue to levy them and just reallocate them, or are you going to just not levy them in the first place? And so you're worried about an 8% here, but you're still collecting a levy over here. You got to look at the overall system and the overall plan, which,
That's what I think we can do with that.
And then, just from, I agree, we should look at that for what Sean's proposed. From my own perspective,
well, that's every year. You look at that every year.
well, I agree, and so I'm saying we should look at it this year.
And next
But-
year and the year after that, and
But
2020.
the other piece of that I would discuss is, to me, if we were to have reduced, the stormwater fee, in my mind, would, in an ideal world, pay for the maintenance once the capital projects are all over. That we get to a point where there's capital projects are at a minimum, and it would pay for the maintenance of the system. I think if I'm looking at more stormwater spending with reduced fee dollars, I want the fee dollars that we're putting in with, which presumably general tax revenue, to be towards capital projects. In my mind, that makes more sense structurally, from my perspective. So that's just a little bit of additional thought on what Sean's saying from my perspective.
All right, why don't we pause then for the council discussion, certainly not to cut it off, but I want to recognize the patience of our audience who sat through one meeting to now sit in this meeting, and I want to open it up for questions and comments from members of the audience over here tonight. And once again, I'll thank you for being here. So if you just raise your hand, we'll just go from there, try to keep it orderly so there's not a mad rush to the microphone. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm just a homeowner who's lived here for almost 20 years. And it's only been in the last few years that I've suddenly received a utility assessment on my water bill. And, you know, as a homeowner, I always thought somewhere my taxes were paying a portion of the maintenance of our water utility system. And that this new revenue that we were being assessed was going to go because we had major projects. And so when I look at this and I hear you talk, and it seems to me that the utilities that were being assessed is all going towards our maintenance and our capital, when I would think, and I think a homeowner would expect, that when we're being assessed for capital projects and not for maintenance. And that most of that maintenance would be coming from where it was coming all along. So, I mean, somewhere in our budget, we had some kind of maintenance fees for this, and now we have a capital project, and so we have assessment for a capital project. So I guess I'm vague on why we have to have so much of this assessment going to maintenance. I understand the need for the maintenance. I just don't understand why this money is allocated to that and there isn't prior money in the budget for maintenance.
Dave, could you
George?
address the reduction
Dad, do you want to take that
property
one?
tax that occurred when the change was made?
When the village initiated the stormwater utility, which is using fees to pay for the cost of owning and maintaining the stormwater system, it was a complete shift to a fee-based system. Prior to January 1st, 2013, the village was using general revenues in the amount of about $815,000 a year, primarily for maintenance and some capital projects, as well as using $1.1 million a year of general revenues to make bond payments on stormwater bonds that we use for capital projects. $815,000 and $1.1 million. When we initiated and started the utility, it was a complete shift. The tax bill, the tax levy went down by those amounts accordingly. So if you actually went back and compared your tax bill, and we understand that most tax bills continue to go up, if you look at the village line items, we had a year where it went down significantly. We're just one of many tax bodies on your bill. We're only about 8% of your bill. So if you look and go back, you can see it, but that is the structural shift that was made.
So the short answer is it used to be in the budget, but then it all shifted to the fee.
Your assumption was right on. You're exactly correct. It's just that reduction that probably
Yeah,
doesn't
but
feel
then
like
it
was there.
eliminated, you gave us a reduction for 1 year.
Repeating every year it's 800,000 that we didn't levy.
Yeah, it's less that gets levied every year.
That's not just once.
But that's just us. I mean, we're this much of your tax bill. College of DuPage County, District 99, District 58, Park District, there's a lot of other people in there. Public safety, pension funds.
DuPage Airport.
DuPage Airport.
Our homes, to me, are an investment. And if our homes get ruined due to flooding problems, or you can't sell your home because there's a flooding in the area, and they get devalued, a lot of homes throughout the town, I don't think that's good. I understand you have to keep maintenance, but capital projects are really important.
Well, and that's a fair point, and then it goes back to, you know, what is the level of maintenance that's probably beyond discussion tonight. But if something either doesn't exist or it's there but it doesn't work and it causes flooding that wipes out businesses and homes, you better believe that's going to be a high priority.
I have a very limited income, but I'm willing to have more money taken for the fees because I want my home to be safe. and I want neighbors' homes to be
Right,
safe.
a lot of people share that view.
But I think the one thing that we've got to always keep in mind is this recommended level of service is 95% of events. We're never going to be perfect.
No, I know that.
And I think that's something from my perspective, looking at the community, we can't promise a level of service that addresses every possible storm.
Right. And on that point, let's just emphasize, we're not talking about 95% of the water, we're talking about 95% of the events.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
There's a lot of ways your house can flood. Only one of them is from storm.
I'm getting water from the infrastructure, because it's not large enough. I've had companies come out, I've handled my water problems, except I'm getting water from the village. I'm getting water from down the block, I'm getting water from the park, I'm getting water across Cumner.
Up on Shady, right? Or
Yes.
yeah.
But and there's the other piece that I think is also worth noting, that sanitary sewer, this is stormwater, sanitary sewer is its own separate governmental unit, which also can cause problems.
Right.
And frequently at the same time.
Yes, unfortunately,
as
at the
these
same
events.
Could I ask when residents speak that we just hear your name and your address so we can keep track of that from now on? So when you talk, so we know, follow up with you?
Becky will be visiting you.
No, but, then we can follow up with you.
You can visit anytime.
Okay, how are
I
you?
can't handle my problems.
What currently is the percentage that we are able to maintain? We're looking at doing 95, that's our goal. What are we currently at today? What percentage?
It varies throughout the village. There are some areas in town that have no formalized system
consistent.
at all, and then they have flooding issues and even moderate rain events. There are other portions of the village that have a modern system and already meet that standard. The best way to sort of judge that, we didn't go parcel by parcel and come up with a percentage, is if you take a look at the maps we produced after the 2007 flood and then the 2013 flood, the areas that flooded in those two major events are the areas that are clearly not meeting this level of service. Also, if you go, another source is our drainage control map, which is just a map of our drainage system on our website. Any area marked LPDA, localized poor drainage area, a local floodplain, clearly is an area that's not meeting this. It tends to be the older parts of town that are not being served at this level.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Steve Lysak, 4819 Prince Street. In the 2007 WIP, I believe I saw a number like to address all the issues, it was like $134 million or something. You've been working on that all along. What percentage of that? Is it this 27 million? That's based on the WIP, so you haven't even touched those recommendations from that 2007 study.
The 2007 study, commonly known as the WIP, had solutions that included both public issues and private issues, and that solutions measured in estimates of hundreds of millions was really getting closer to 100% in all areas, just every solution you could think of. From there, you had to break out private versus public systems, which cut that number significantly down. From that, we've invested about $27 million in the highest priority action items that were in that 2007 plan. That $27 million got us farther than we expected because we found ways to value engineer the projects, do them better than we originally had thought. And prices, especially during the recession, came way down and our dollars went a lot farther than we expected. So we got significantly through the high priority action items that were included in the 2007 plan. Some of the items that exist right now of potential capital projects in our current plan are related to or directly showed up in the list of projects in the 2007 plan.
And in 2013, is there overlap on any of those?
Some.
There's not as much overlap as you'd think. What we found is that the 2007 event was very different than the 2013 event. Speaking to this, we can never guarantee a certain percentage. The 2007 event tended to flood in areas that weren't served by substantial systems or significant stormwater systems. In 2007, it was the LPDAs that flooded, a lot more neighborhood flooding. 2013 was much larger regional event across the entire northern part of Illinois and through the Midwest, intended to flood out areas in the 100-year floodplain and the 500-year floodplain. If you flooded in 07, you may not have flooded in 13 and vice versa. Is that pretty close, man? Good enough for a manager, not an engineer, but that close.
All I know is I flooded in both. So-
There are many that flooded in both.
Again, I apologize, because this will be a couple more minutes. I like to have a third voice to your conversation. And somebody who had significant property damage in this last flood, there's not only those of us who are worried about flooding and how to control and save our houses and our property, there's not only those of us who are trying to control our expenses and want to manage our fees versus taxes and what we're outlaying versus what the city's spending, but there's a third voice that is there, that is how this fee is structured and the legality of the structure and how it imposes back its responsibilities in the collection process, i.e. specifically nonprofits participating. This is a tax. I still believe it's a tax. We've had that conversation before. I want to extend that conversation because I think there has to be some planning in the sense that if that argument eventually wins, we're going to find ourselves in a hole. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't practice law. And I know we got outstanding city representation. But I think if you really look hard, and I think it's what Church of Peace versus Rock Island, the appellate court came up with criteria of what is a tax versus a fee. And they came up with 3 criteria. And they talked about the ability to levy versus collect, and they talked specifically about the measurable benefit that goes back against the individual or the community. And then they said, clearly, this is a fee. Hence the reason now why we're getting all these multiple stormwater utility functions across the state. But I think you can argue, and I think some will probably argue, that they erred in that definition. Because in reality, you can't really specifically measure. Now, I'm not doing this so we can argue the legality of this tonight. What I'm really doing is to throw this out, so when you go back into conference and you sit about talking about the structure and what the long-term plan should be, there is exposure here. Because I do believe that when you do a capital project or even maintenance, Ogden and 355, that benefit is not measurable or specific to me over here at 201 56th Street, Deer Creek, which y'all know flooded. So to me, it's a tax. And eventually, I think it will be upheld as a tax. It may take 5 years, it may take 6 years. And then if it becomes a tax, then the nonprofits really should not be levied against this fee. And I think you can circumvent that problem by removing the nonprofits now. That's argument number 1. And then number 2, I think there's still a social contract here. A social contract that we're not really even considering. Zweig versus St. Louis, MSD, set the standard of measurable standard. Missouri Supreme Court, I know Illinois doesn't have to follow it, but it's still a Supreme Court decision, 2012, and it says you can't give a specific measurable event to an individual back against a general community purchase or activity. This is a general community activity. We benefit as a community, you assess this as a community, we participate as a community, and we benefit as a whole. And you can't sit there and say that one person is individually getting a service or good versus somebody else. And I think that's the flaw in our structure here, and I do think that gives risk to long-term planning and funding. But finally, the nonprofits. Our budgets are cracked. I mean, you heard churches come to you and say that they may have to lay a person or 2 off, or somebody may have to close a food bank, or the pressures are going with the funding. And I appreciate the ability of the 8.7%, you will fund it, you won't fund it, and can we control the cost? The fact of the matter is, you're already putting a social burden on your nonprofits to close gaps that exist in social services to this community. And then to turn around and ask those nonprofits to continue to provide for those social services, in addition, I think violates that social contract that exists between our community and our religious nonprofits and our nonprofits that are not religious who are providing those services. And I do just think that's fundamentally wrong. And then finally, and then I'll shut up, so I apologize, but I will shut up. I get we think that there's outside dollars coming to the churches because maybe we have Naperville residents and Oak Brook residents and all those kind of things that are coming into our town. The fact of the matter is, in our church alone, it's less than 25%. Several of the smaller churches in the middle of the city are less than 10%. That collection of outside dollars does not, in my mind, overrule the extra burden that you're putting me as a citizen who is gladly paying it through his utility fee, although I'd rather have the tax deduction through property taxes. It says the controls of the statutes and limitations of increased property taxes and that kind of stuff. for an argument, love to do it another day, or tonight if we don't want. And then, but really, what should be done is that it be lowered in the sense that it can be managed, remove the nonprofits, and let then the community share that burden as a whole. And if it's got to be done, and I don't think anybody's here arguing it can't be done, we can always argue about how it should be managed. You know, Commissioner, you made a great point. We haven't raised our administrative costs in, what, 4 years? The fact is, we probably should have. We should pass those through as property tax increases, and we should probably use that to maintain the maintenance system for the water collection and not done utility. So I just kind of share that. We don't necessarily have to argue the legal, although I'd love to someday, but I think there's a threat. I think we're ill-defined as far as the legal structure. I think there's exposure as far as when this eventually gets adjudicated, because it's gonna, let's face it. We double the number of utilities in the next 3 years. You know as well as I do, it's gonna get adjudicated. And then I still believe that we as Downers Grove are violating that social contract, especially with our religious nonprofits.
Just to clarify, administrative and operational costs have gone up. It's just that the other revenues outside of property tax have covered that increase.
Thanks. Thanks for that. Other questions? Thank you for the comments. Other questions, comments from folks in the audience?
Tom LaFrance, 505 Chicago Avenue. I'd like to talk about history to see if I'm correct. When we initiated this stormwater report, the report that came from the consultant started out with a certain fee dollar. And if I recall correctly, there were 15% increases per year for 14 years. 15 years.
Correct.
How are we now at 8.7%?
When that initial stormwater utility report came out and modeled 15% increases, it was on a base of maintenance costs and some capital costs only. The base fee amount did not cover the $1.1 million a year fixed payments to existing debt. 8.7% on a larger base is the same increase as 15% on the smaller base. For those of you who paid attention in 8th grade algebra, you can do it. But that was the shift that was made. So it's not exact, Tom, but it's real close.
The other question I have is, we're going to issue bonds in 17 and 20. When will those be paid off? And what percentage of the, when we get to 2028, what percentage of those fees is going to debt payment?
We don't have the specific numbers yet. We've contemplated a 20-year payment streams, 20-year amortization period. And just to complicate things a little bit, as far as answering that question, we've been using variable payment amounts. We've been stacking various bond issuances so that we can have a steady total payment amount, or one that increases in a predictable manner over time. We're a little premature in that. We don't have those exact numbers. You remember that graph that looks a little bit like the Tetris game and you fit all the bond payments in? The goal is to have predictable and sustainable total debt payments for the long term.
Thanks for the comment. Before we go a second round, anyone who hasn't already asked a question or made a comment?
This guy.
Yeah, I was just going to ask
Sure.
a question. Mark Hader, 1920 Hitchcock Avenue. So we had probably 6 houses, 3 houses to the left of me, 3 houses to the right of me. They had an excessive amount of water. And so I know one of the things we were talking about was the capital projects. And so how do you decide, like, where you're going to put your basins and stuff like that?
I'm now going to turn over.
That's an engineering question.
Yeah, man.
That's what the 2013 flood study answered. Did you get flooding in the April 2013 flood?
Of course, yes.
And we have our follow-up flood study online. That was more of on a preliminary basis. We looked at each of those areas and did some very preliminary level engineering. We still need to proceed to do more final engineering for more costs and solutions, but that information would be found in that study. Or to call staff. We're happy to talk to anybody and get as much information as we can and help answer those questions.
So it varies by neighborhood, basically, by the attributes of the neighborhood?
Right, and by the type of problem that was experienced in that neighborhood and what's available already, what level of services there currently, can we use existing facilities? Are there any facilities there now? All those kind of questions. Each one is kind of specific to the area.
I happen to be the low point of that area, which is, was nice when I bought the house and it was dry, of course, and come to find out. So I was going to chosen tear my neighbor that didn't make it today to sell his house if you're looking for a volunteer.
If you want to talk to Andy Sikich in the back before you leave tonight, we'll start that conversation with you right now.
We're serious about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's right there. Raise your hand, Andy.
Well, that's along the same lines. I was wondering how, when, and where is the decision made to acquire property? Because I'm in the same boat as him. I'm at the bottom of the pit.
Yeah, and understood, and all of this, I mean, we get the full range of views on this. There's those that say, don't you dare come after my property. Then there's that say, please take my property. There's a whole lot of different angles on that, and I'll give you the unfrozen caveman lawyer answer to that, not the engineering answer, but like with a lot of other things, there are objective criteria in terms of, is there a solution, is there an engineered solution to it, or to not necessarily that property, because we try to implement solutions that will affect a region or an area, not just one house, because that's not a good necessarily sense of the best investment. You want to get the best investment you can. But then there are those that just, there is no engineered solution possible, and that might make sense. But then obviously it becomes, when does the opportunity present itself? Is a reasonable return? If somebody says, buy my house, they want $1.5 million on it, that's probably not going to happen. But if it becomes available, like for example, the study that I talked about, the average real estate purchases in here are less than $200,000. Some are less than $100,000. That's one aspect of it. And then some of the other aspects are, we may be talking about property acquisitions that are vacant. It's just that they allow the village access to do some of the capital and maintenance projects that we're talking about. We've done some of those where people complain, hey, why aren't you maintaining this area? Well, we don't have the rights to go do that. It's private. We have to then go get the rights to do it, and that costs money. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it, but I would hazard to say it's opportunistic.
And
That
if
fair to
you'd
say?
like,
Thank you.
if you want to have that conversation even right now, Jim Tock is here, Andy Sikich is here. They're well versed in that. You can actually go meet right now, and we have a meeting room off to the side. If you want to get into that level of detail, we can start that conversation.
Right. But we're not standing around with a checkbook just.
That depends on what they ask you.
It's not that. It's that, it's not if I'm going to flood, it's when. So it just needs to be fixed.
It's kind of like that old definition of, who was the Supreme Court justice said, I can't define pornography, but I can know it when I see it. The ones that we purchase, you kind of know it when you see them. Yes?
Anthony Chang, unfortunately, Becky foiled my attempt to be anonymous here. But Anthony Chang, 5517 North Cares. A few questions. I've heard this discussion point brought up about the nonprofits. I'm just kind of curious what percentage of income streams will we be generating from nonprofits? Just since I've heard it a few times, I'm kind of curious about that.
If you look up online for the FY14 budget, there were some links there that had stormwater additional reports. It's all broken down in those charts and graphs there.
Okay. And then another one is, I noticed that the 95% of events is, as we know, gets a point of diminishing returns. Do we hit a point of diminishing returns at the 95%? Is there like a sooner point where a unit of expenditure no longer equals the same unit of gain, of whatever that measurable gain may be?
Yes, the diminishing returns really start to become noticeable around the 95% mark. It's not as specific as it sounds, 95%. It's very much theoretical, but certainly there's a lot of bang for the buck going up until this point, and then it just skyrockets cost compared to benefits if you try to solve 100% of the events.
Okay. And then I just want to say I do like Mr. Durkin's recommendation on looking at what other possible changes. Wall tightening belts. I think it's just an option to evaluate.
All right, I'll take advantage of the momentary lull to bring it back if there are any other questions or comments from any members of the village council about where we're at. I got the sense to try to bring this plane to a landing here, speaking of 40,000 feet, that so far I've heard most people say that, I'll come back to Commissioner Barnett in a second, but there were general support for the staff recommendations, although Commissioner Barnett wanted to see a different modeling, and I heard other people interested in that as well in terms of how the maintenance piece might look differently. I'm not saying it the same way you did it, I'm just highlighting, I think we heard what you said. I was just pointing out that you asked for a different modeling of that graph up there, and I think that would be worth seeing.
A question about the graph. Am I approximately understanding the cash on hand plus revenue streams as projected? If you just, for the sake of discussing something in specifics, if you took the 8.7% intended, right, and you took the cash on hand as available now, you could, within the next year or two, do 100% of your, get up to 100% of maintenance and do $2 or $3 million worth of capital.
Maintenance at 100% is about $3.8 million a year. We're currently generating about $3.8 million a year in fees. We have $5 to $7 million on hand, give or take. It's no head nods.
So,
we'll
yeah,
have to
so
double
it's
check that.
we're not writing checks on these numbers tonight, but you could, with your existing revenue stream, you could start doing all your maintenance.
Yes.
You would still have 3, 5, whatever the number is, $1 million of cash on hand to spend over the next couple of years, 2, 3 years, for capital work.
Yes.
And at that point, you could bond and increase enough to service your bonding, which would effectively have sort of no gap in your capital investment structure.
It would slow the capital investment structure from what is planned.
Slow it.
Slow it,
would
but
just
not
do it.
structurally change it. It would slow it. And I just want to comment that
It would kind of slow yours.
the $10 million, debt service on $10 million is about 700 and some thousand a year.
For 20 years.
So for every year for 20 years. So in the year that you decide to issue that bonds, if you were kind of keeping flat at the current rate, you'd have to increase it significantly in that 1 year if you wanted to jump right to
Well,
that.
I was prefacing that conversation on the intended 8.7 increase
Correct.
each year, so you wouldn't be totally flat, but in terms of what you were doing with
Correct.
your money,
Correct.
you could start maintaining 100% on your revenue streams as they stand. You could do $3 to $5 million worth of capital the next couple of years, and use your increases to begin to be ready for your bond issuance 3 years out.
Yes, and the way I heard that, for those visually oriented, is it would be a shift of some of this blue line to bring the reds up closer, and then the blue line would start to mimic the balance of this after the bond issuance.
Because your red gap is not nearly as big as your blue gap. That's really what's being reflected by
Correct.
my comment.
Red is maintenance, blue is capital. Thank you. Yes, I got it.
Right.
I just want my comments to be clear. I was suggesting we do no capital.
No, yeah,
That's-
understood.
I got it.
Understood.
Got it.
And I think it would be helpful for all of us and everyone in the room and beyond to see what you just described, what that would look like in the bar chart here.
This has been incredibly helpful. What we'd like to do is, you'll see a version of this come out with the LRP, the Long Range Planning document itself. But frankly, maybe more importantly, as we get towards this budget discussion, we'll probably give you 2 or 3 options. We'll show you what the plan is with some tweaks, but then we'll be able to actually model 3 years at a time. We're comfortable with 3-year models. We think that's a short enough horizon to get pretty accurate. And we can show shifts and changes and what that would do to various revenues. So, Mayor, from where we sit, unless staff had any other questions or comments, this has been incredibly helpful at the 40,000 foot level where we are.
I don't want to have a conversation tonight because it's not really the point, but as it relates to Sean and David's comments, as it relates to Jim's comments, I, as most know, probably have a huge problem with the structure. I'd like to have that conversation. The issue tonight that I was trying to stay focused on, I think we did, is whether it comes via fees as it sits today, fees modified in some way, or property taxes, irrespective. The goal at the right side of that is an enormous amount of revenue generation. And that's, I think, the question is how quickly are we going to do what is sort of the direction of 40,000 foot. chime in for the record that I'd love to have that conversation. But I think it's important that we separate the two issues a little bit, because whether we solve that tonight, this year, in 10 years, whether it gets adjudicated and solved for us, the fact is we've still got systems that we have to maintain and investments we have to make that I think everybody here is committed to making.
I think that's right, and that goes back to the last couple of years when we had that same conversation, is nobody disagreed that we have maintenance and capital need to get done, and we have a rough idea how much it's going to cost. Then we can talk about over what course of time, structures, and get all those details, but there's no dispute that there are needs, both on the capital and the maintenance side, that need to be addressed. So, any final questions or comments from the audience? Otherwise, I want to thank you on behalf of myself and my colleagues for your patience in sitting through everything else. And oh yes, see, if I kept talking long enough, I knew someone
Can
was
the
going to
bonds
be
be put out sooner so we can get some of these capital gains projects done sooner? Or do we have other bonds out there that we have to weigh?
Capacity question.
We are-
Good question.
We are close to capacity in the aggregate level, which means that we're bumping up against this concept of moderate overall debt level for the entire community. And if we try to issue more faster than planned, it may cost us significantly more in interest rates because our rating may drop. So right now, we're sort of maximizing the value of our AAA rating and the amount we've put in debt so far. The 2016 is important because we have 2 bond issuances that roll off about that time. Library debt and Fairview Avenue improvement debt. They fall off, we pay those off, and so we have more capacity at that time.
That's what I was afraid.
Not to, sorry to interrupt. If interest rates really go up as much as they think there is, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head, would it be better to go to a AA rating versus a AAA rating and get the rate now versus having the Federal Reserve?
He's going to have a heart attack if you start talking about that. He'll drop dead right here and now.
Yeah, again, I didn't fix the life insurance policy yet on who gets what when I die, so.
You know, that's a good point. We never set out specifically to get a AAA rating. What we set out to do is stay within the moderate range, because if you go beyond moderate, you're not worried so much about AA+, you're worried about other things.
Right.
And then it just so happened that when the rating agencies saw how we approached our infrastructure systems and sustainability plans, which Jeff was talking about, we earned the AAA, but we didn't set out. We were clearly comfortable being AA+ and getting sort of the best of both worlds, but we were rewarded with a AAA, which is great to keep.
It seemed to me that the variant rate on AA is just as good versus, 15 Federal Reserve rate increases between now and 2020, or 2017, or 2018, right? I mean, we'd have to talk to somebody who really knows what they're talking about, but that would make sense to me, so borrow now.
You think we're gonna have 15 federal rating
There it is.
increases?
Janet Yellen, baby, job slots is gone.
That's all the time we have for tonight's show. Next week.
Jesus Christ.
From the same-
Wow. So what's the stock market gonna close at? 30,000 points or what?
I'm going to ask for something that I always ask for. What does it look like you do as a pay-as-you-go?
What's that?
A pay-as-you-go, as
Everybody
best we can, because let's go borrow money. Let's go borrow money. For every dollar you borrow, you're going to be paying 3.
If we
And
do
you're
a,
putting that burden on the future residents, on current residents, and future residents. So I'm in no rush to go out and borrow as much as we can and pay back $2 for every one we get extra.
if we go to a pay-as-you-go, as opposed to pay-as-you-use, then these double stacks of what we plan to spend would drop from the $6 to $7 million a year to 3.8 every year. And the gap between the current level of service and the recommended level of service would be.
But at the end of the line, you wouldn't be paying all that interest, and you'd have more money to put in your infrastructure.
You'd also stretch out how long people are flooding and whatnot, right? I mean,
Correct.
at that point,
Well,
by the time we got to the recommended level
but
of
you're
service.
you're
Well, hang on,
serious
by the time
problems
we
you
get
can
to
still
the
get
recommended
fixed.
level of service, David and I'd be your age.
But how many people are going to leave the village if you keep flooding, your home values
Well,
go down?
every home, you're not gonna be able to fix everything, so you can still fix major projects. You can still have major projects. It takes longer, but it doesn't mean everybody's gonna buy rowboats.
Yeah, but then you're playing Russian roulette with our houses.
Well, there's another section of town
Because you don't
that,
know.
there's another section, other sections of town that aren't gonna benefit from all the extra money that they're putting into the project.
Clearly, there's a difference of opinion on this
So,
topic.
yeah.
And we've heard both sides of it.
I lived in Palatine and I flooded, and I never once, ever blamed the village of Palatine for my water problems.
Right, but you did move to Downers Grove.
Exactly. I passed it on. After spending thousands to fix it, but I didn't blame the village for my dumb mistake.
Yeah, I don't want to be
I'll buy that exact house. I moved on.
All right.
All right.
All right, well, I thank you very much for being here tonight. We really appreciate everyone's comments. And stay dry out there. We are adjourned.
How about